All right, let's paint a picture. Just imagine you're here in the U.S. working hard, and you're sending some money back home.
Yeah.
Maybe it's going to family in Mumbai, maybe somewhere near Kochi down in Kerala, or, a village perhaps in Tamil Nadu, somewhere like Coimbatore.
That money means everything back there. It's not just cash.
Exactly.
Huh.
It's rent, it's doctor's bills, school fees, just helping family make ends meet. It's your connection, your support.
It really is a lifeline for so many people. Millions, frankly.
Yeah.
Now, picture the U.S. government saying, hold on, we want a little piece of that transfer.
Right. It feels unexpected, maybe a bit jarring. And that's precisely what we're digging into today. We're pulling back the curtain on this huge piece of U.S. legislation they're calling the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Quite a name.
Isn't it? And we're focusing specifically on one part. A proposed 3.5% tax on money sent out of the country by non-citizens living in the U.S. Our mission here is to really get under the hood of this. What could it mean, especially for India, which is, the world's remittance heavyweight, and for all those families counting on these funds?
And look, this isn't just some idea floating around. This bill, it actually passed the U.S. House of Representatives pretty recently, May 12th, 2025.
That recent, wow.
Yeah. So if it makes it through the Senate and gets signed off by the president, this tax could actually kick in, potentially, as early as January 2026.
Okay, so to really get why this is a big deal, we need to understand the scale we're talking about. India isn't just a top recipient of remittances, it's the top recipient, by a long shot.
The numbers are, well, they're pretty staggering. In 2023 alone, India took in $119.5 billion, billion with a B.
Wow.
And a massive slice of that comes from right here, from the U.S. In the last fiscal year, 2023-24, the U.S. accounted for about 27.7% of India's total. That works out to roughly $33 billion.
$33 billion flowing from the U.S. to India in just 1 year. It's easy for those numbers to feel abstract, but for India's economy, they are incredibly concrete, aren't they?
Absolutely. Remittances were about 3.4% of India's entire GDP in 2023. And maybe even more critically, they act as this vital cushion against India's trade deficit, the difference between what it imports and exports.
A buffer.
Exactly. Over the last decade or so, remittances have covered, on average, something like 42.2% of that deficit. And think back to 2020-21, a really turbulent time globally.
Yeah.
They covered an incredible 80% of it. So these transfers, they're not just nice to haves, they're economic shock absorbers for the country and fundamental support for millions of households.
So let's get practical. How would this tax actually work, on the ground?
Yeah.
What are the mechanics here?
It's pretty straightforward, conceptually at least. It's proposed as a flat 3.5% tax, and it applies to any money sent outside the U.S. by individuals who aren't U.S. citizens.
And that casts a wide net, right? Who does that include?
Oh, yeah, a very wide net. We're talking international students, people on H-1B visas. Those are typically for skilled professionals, engineers, IT folks, doctors, and even people with green cards. So legal permanent residents, but not citizens yet. They'd all be subject to this.
Okay, so let's put a number on it. Make it real. If someone sends, say, $1,000 back home to India.
Right, so you'd pay whatever fee the money transfer service charges,
Right.
Western Union, Remitly, whatever.
Standard fees, yeah.
Plus, under this proposal, an extra $35 would go directly to the U.S. government. It's a direct skim off the top of the money being sent.
$35 on every 1,000.
Mhm.
Okay, but why? Why this tax? Why target this group, these specific transfers? What's the official reasoning?
Well, the stated goals, as they've been discussed around the bill, seem to be mainly about money, funding, basically.
Okay.
They're talking about helping to pay for the tax cuts that were enacted back in 2017 and also channeling more funds towards border security initiatives.
Right, funding priorities.
There's also been some chatter, particularly you see it online, in forums, on platforms like X, suggesting another angle. Some proponents seem to hope it might encourage what they call self-deportation. Now, that's a pretty loaded term, and not usually in the official language.
Sure.
But it's part of the conversation happening around the bill. We're just laying out the different motivations being discussed.
And that term, self-deportation, it immediately flags one of the biggest criticisms, doesn't it?
Mm.
The main argument against this tax from various groups seems to be that it's basically taxing the same money twice.
Exactly. That's the core of the critique. This money, the money being sent home, it was already earned as income in the U.S. It's already been subject to U.S. income tax.
So it's like you
Here.
earn your paycheck, pay income tax on it, then you go buy, I don't know, a pizza,
Right.
and then the government wants another tax just because you're taking the pizza out of the shop. to share it with someone else.
That's a great analogy, yeah. You've already paid tax on the money you used to buy the pizza. This feels like a second bite at the apple, so to speak.
Okay, so from the mechanics and the reasoning, let's shift to the impact. What could this really mean for India, that heavyweight champ of remittances we mentioned?
This is where it gets really, really concerning for India. Applying a 3.5% tax on those huge flows from the U.S., well, it could mean a serious drop in the actual money arriving in India each year.
How much are we talking?
The estimates I've seen are suggesting anywhere from maybe $1.2 billion to $1.65 billion less per year flowing into India. Depends on the final details and how people might change their behavior, of course.
Wow. Over $1 billion potentially shaved off annually.
Yeah.
That has to hit India's foreign exchange reserves, right? Those reserves, I think you mentioned they were around $677.8 billion in April 2025.
Exactly. A drop in those reserves means the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, has less firepower, less flexibility to intervene in currency markets if the Indian rupee starts to weaken or get volatile.
And that connects directly to people listening, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A weaker rupee often means
Higher inflation, yeah. For everyday people in India, it can mean imports cost more fuel, electronics, other goods. Your daily expenses can creep up. That's the sort of ripple effect from these good macroeconomic shifts.
But it's not just about currency charts and trade balances. There's a huge human story here. These remittances, they aren't just abstract economic flows. They are, as you said, lifelines.
Absolute lifelines. For millions of families, especially concentrated in certain states like Maharashtra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, they receive a very large share of these funds.
And think about what that money actually pays for on the ground.
Right. It's not funding luxury trips. It's paying for a kid's school fees, their textbooks. It's covering essential medical bills for elderly parents. It's helping pay the rent or just putting food on the table week after week.
It supports daily existence and maybe allows families to participate in important things like weddings or festivals like Diwali, maybe in those tier 2 cities like Coimbatore or Kochi you mentioned. Basic needs, fundamentally.
Right.
Let's make it even more concrete. Let's invent someone, say. Anil. He's a software engineer, maybe in Silicon Valley on an H-1B visa.
Yeah.
Works long hours. He diligently sends $1,000 every month back home to his parents in Chennai.
Okay, a typical scenario for many.
Right. Under this proposed tax, that $1,000 transfer suddenly costs him an extra $35 every single month.
Do that math over a year.
That's $420 a year. Gone. Just an extra tax to the U.S. government on top of his income tax, on top of the transfer fees he already pays.
And what does that $420 mean for his parents back in Chennai?
Well, it's not pocket change. It could easily be a semester's worth of textbooks for a younger sibling studying.
Yeah.
Or maybe it covers a couple of really important doctor's visits for his elderly parents.
Yeah.
It's a tangible loss that directly impacts their well-being, their quality of life, and Anil is just one hypothetical person.
Exactly. Now scale that up. You mentioned the numbers earlier. Over 2.9 million people of Indian origin living in the U.S. in 2023. It's the second largest immigrant group here, and growing fast, up 63% since 2010. So this proposed tax isn't affecting a handful of people. It potentially impacts millions of households across India, hitting their ability to support family back home.
And that leads to another potential problem, a really significant one. What happens when you make the official, legal ways of sending money more expensive?
People look for cheaper alternatives, right? Even if they're less official.
We could see a push towards informal channels.
You're probably thinking about systems like Hawala.
Exactly. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. Hawala is basically an ancient system built entirely on trust. It operates outside the formal banking sector. You give money to a Hawala broker or Hawaladar in one country, and through their network of contacts, another broker pays out the equivalent amount to your recipient in another country. There's no actual money crossing borders through banks.
And it's often faster and cheaper than formal methods.
Often, yes. But it's also completely unregulated, and in most places, illegal. It's incredibly hard for governments, the U.S., India, anywhere, to track money moving through these networks.
Which opens the door to all sorts of risks, right? Fraud, money laundering.
Absolutely. Financing illicit activities. It's a major concern for law enforcement and financial regulators worldwide.
And here's the kicker, the potential irony.
Right. If this 3.5% tax is high enough to push a significant volume of these remittances underground into channels like Hawala,
Then the U.S. government might actually end up collecting less tax revenue than they hoped. They'd be driving transactions into a black market they can't see, let alone tax.
It's a classic example of potential unintended consequences, isn't it? Trying to solve one problem, potentially creating or worsening another?
Okay, let's zoom out now. Look at the bigger picture, the geopolitics. What kind of signal does a tax like this send internationally?
Well, it certainly feels like a signal towards a more protectionist stance from the U.S. And given the sheer volume of money involved, India is arguably the country most directly in the spotlight here.
Yeah, and there's a definite irony, isn't there? Indian immigrants are such a huge part of the U.S. success story, especially in tech and medicine.
Absolutely. Engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, they're major drivers of innovation, economic growth, particularly in hubs like Silicon Valley.
So imposing a special tax on the money they send home to support their families, it feels a bit like, I don't know, charging your star quarterback an extra fee just for being on the team and scoring touchdowns.
It's an interesting way to put it, and it could definitely put some strain on U.S.-India relations. Both countries have been putting a lot of effort into strengthening ties recently. Trade deals, defense cooperation, tech partnerships.
Right, a lot of positive momentum.
A policy like this, which is perceived as disproportionately affecting the Indian diaspora, could potentially, introduce some friction, maybe cool things down a bit, despite progress elsewhere.
But looking at it from the other side, could this actually push India to react in a way that benefits it long term?
That's a possibility. It might act as a spur, a catalyst for India to double down on diversifying its economy, maybe reducing its reliance specifically on remittances from the U.S., perhaps by further boosting domestic industries, creating more jobs at home, or maybe strengthening remittance channels from other major sources, like the Gulf countries, which are also very significant.
That raises a key question, though. From the U.S. side, why specifically target non-citizens for this tax?
Well, politically speaking, it's often seen as an easier path to raising revenue. Non-citizens generally don't vote in U.S. federal elections.
The political calculus.
Right. So taxing them might be perceived as carrying less direct political risk for lawmakers compared to taxing citizens. However, critics immediately push back on that.
How so?
They point out, quite rightly, that non-citizens already contribute hugely to the U.S. economy and tax base. They pay income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes if they own homes. They are very much part of the tax system already.
They're already paying their share, essentially.
That's the argument, yes. And the reactions we're seeing to this proposal are all over the map. Online, especially on platforms like X, you see people calling it poor policy, highlighting that double taxation issue, the risk of driving money underground.
But then there are other voices, too.
Oh, yes. You also see some, particularly those advocating for much stricter immigration policies, suggesting the tax isn't high enough. Some have even floated rates like 50% or even 100%.
90%.
Yeah, with the explicit goal, as they state it, of encouraging that self-deportation we mentioned earlier. So it's a really polarized debate.
And beyond the online debate, is there a risk of real-world pushback, like from other countries?
There absolutely is. The risk of foreign retaliation is real. Other governments, India included, might look at this and think, okay, if you're taxing our citizens sending money home, maybe we should look at taxing U.S. companies operating here.
Sort of tit for tat.
Potentially. Imagine India imposing a new tax specifically on the profits that, say, Apple or Google or other big U.S. tech firms send back to the U.S. from their huge operations in India. That would suddenly make doing business abroad less attractive for American companies.
Okay, so facing this potential tax, what can India or individuals actually do? What are the potential strategies or responses?
Well, the materials we've looked through suggest a few avenues. Diplomatically, India could push hard, lobby the U.S. government, maybe argue for exemptions. Perhaps funds clearly earmarked for education or healthcare could be excluded.
Leveraging existing platforms, too.
Right. India's already active at places like the World Trade Organization, arguing for lower remittance costs globally. This could become another point of focus in those discussions.
What about domestically, within India?
India could focus on strengthening its own economic buffers, as we touched on, diversifying where its foreign exchange comes from, maybe encouraging more foreign direct investment, or leaning more on remittances from the Gulf or other regions.
And what about individuals, the NRIs in the U.S.?
There's a likely behavioral response. If this tax looks like it's definitely happening, you could see a rush. People might try to send larger amounts, maybe lump sums, back home before that potential January or 2026 start date hits.
Trying to beat the clock.
Exactly. And then there's innovation. Fintech companies are always looking for ways to disrupt traditional finance. Maybe they'll develop even cheaper, more efficient ways to transfer money internationally, perhaps using things like blockchain to offset some of the taxes impact.
And then there was that more aggressive idea.
The reciprocity tax idea, yes.
Yeah.
Taxing U.S. companies in India. It's certainly an option on the table, a way to push back directly. But it's a high-stakes move. It carries pretty significant risks for diplomatic relations and potential trade disputes.
Okay, so lots of potential downsides and complexities.
hmm
But are there any potential upsides, any silver linings for India in all this, however slight?
It's interesting you ask. Some analysts actually do point to potential, maybe unexpected benefits. Forcing diversification away from U.S. remittance reliance could, in the long run, make India's economy more resilient.
Yeah.
It might also inadvertently boost domestic programs. Think Digital India, Skill India. If opportunities abroad become slightly less attractive due to this tax, it might encourage more talent to stay and contribute within India, boosting local innovation and job creation.
And maybe a shift in how U.S. companies operate.
Possibly. If employing H-1B workers becomes marginally more complex or costly due to this remittance tax issue, maybe some U.S. companies shift more of their IT or back office operations to their delivery centers in India, places like Bengaluru, Hyderabad, Pune. That would mean more jobs created directly in India.
And you mentioned the potential pre-2026 rush.
Right. That temporary surge in remittances and perhaps associated investments could give India's foreign exchange reserves a short-term boost or maybe stimulate certain sectors like real estate or the stock market. So some potential, perhaps temporary positives.
There, finally, it's crucial to remember this isn't just a U.S.-India story, right? We need to place it in a global context.
Absolutely vital. India is the biggest recipient, yes, but it's far from alone. Think about Mexico, number 2 globally, received something like $68 billion in 2024. A huge amount, much of it from the U.S.
They'd be significantly impacted, too.
Definitely. And then there's the Philippines, Nigeria, Pakistan, many others. This proposed U.S. tax, if enacted, wouldn't just affect one bilateral relationship. It could actually reshape global financial flows and have knock-on effects for numerous developing economies worldwide.
It really underscores how interconnected everything is now. One policy decision in Washington can ripple out across the entire globe.
It really does. No country is an island, financially speaking.
So let's try and wrap up this deep dive. What we're looking at is this fundamental tension, isn't it? The U.S. government looking to tax remittances from non-citizens, driven by, domestic funding needs and perhaps other policy goals.
Colliding head-on with the potentially massive economic and, just as importantly, human impact this could have on countries like India and on the millions of families whose daily lives depend on that flow of money.
And just to recap the current status, as of today, May 30th, 2025, the bill containing this tax has passed the U.S. House. It's now being debated in the Senate.
The target date mentioned for a potential presidential signature is July 4th, 2025. And if all that happens, the tax itself could become effective from January 1st, 2026. And it would likely be the banks and the money transfer companies themselves who would be responsible for actually collecting that 3.5%.
So this is clearly a situation that requires some serious planning, both for non-resident Indians living and working here, and certainly a strategic, very carefully considered response from the Indian government.
And it really leaves us with this big open question, doesn't it? How will this all play out in the end? Will the tax achieve what the U.S. government intends, raise revenue, maybe influence migration?
Or will the unintended side effects end up being the bigger story? Things like, driving more money into those hard-to-track underground channels or putting real strain on important international partnerships.
It's a powerful reminder, I think, that in this connected world we live in, money crossing borders is never just a simple spreadsheet entry. Decisions made thousands of miles away can have incredibly real, tangible, and sometimes quite painful impacts on families, communities, and entire economies across the globe.